looking at how similar, based on FST values, is the upper summit to the lower summit. And 0 is like exactly the same pretty much, and 1 is completely different species. Sorry, should have mentioned that before. So this is very close to 0, so upper summit and lower summit are very similar across all the loci. And likewise, Westford and Acton, remember they're geographically proximate to each other. But then these two summit populations and Natchez, which are geographically proximal, much more so than any of the other ponds, are really departing from that 0 FST value. So that kind of gives you an idea of the differentiation that we found that was interesting between that low level mountain population and the higher one.
Do you have any sense what you would expect to find if you threw in a real outgroup, like a population from New York or something?
No.
Like, I wonder what FSTs would look like in other populations in this species.
I mean, we could pretty easily plug in Kelly's Meteos data.
Sure.
And do that. Okay. I didn't think about doing that, but yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, but the FST between the upper and lower summits is not that high. It's just it's between upper and Natchez and lower and Natchez. But I mean, I guess Natchez is the lower part of the mountain.
Yeah. Sorry, you want me to go? I can show you again. Probably should have driven home that message a little better. This doesn't really help. But yeah, so these are super close to each other. I don't know what exactly. Scott, what would you estimate?
500 feet.
500 feet. Sounds good. But then Natchez is like 1 kilometer away down the mountain. Yeah. So much closer to these populations than like these two are. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Whoa, little time delay. Okay, so I took those FST results and did a principal components analysis just to kind of lay out a little more individualized way to think about how these are correlating to each other. So these allele frequency values are clustering based on FST, more so along this, more so in a predictable pattern along this elevation gradient than on this distance gradient. Because we would kind of think that, or less so, sorry, along this elevation gradient than on the distance gradient. Because we would think that on elevation, Natchez would be right here with these populations because it's much closer in elevation to the summit populations. And then these would be probably about where they are, because this is 120 meters elevation, these are like 70-ish meters elevation. So this is really the interesting population that we found. So who knows what I can infer whatever I want, I guess. But after thinking and reading a lot, I kind of settled on, since we see similar allele frequencies existing only in some nearby populations and not in all, then that was one of my hypotheses. Some gradient other than geographic distance is influencing the evolution of these animals. And then kind of disproves one of the other hypotheses that we came up with because they're not all similar in all sets of nearby populations. That means that geography isn't limiting them. It's not limiting breeding groups on its own. Something else is structuring these populations. So these unexpected similarities and dissimilarities. So like I mentioned a couple times, that Natchez Pond is separated from the summit by a shorter distance than some of the other populations. It's forested landscape. There is one paved road and some hiking trails, but it's not like a high traffic area. And then there are very few other types of human-induced fragmentation. Habitat fragmentation is a common concept discussed in ecology, especially among amphibians. And then Acton and Westford, which are more genetically similar to each other than the Natchez Pond and the Summit Ponds, all on the mountain, they're further apart from each other. The salamanders have to cross through neighborhoods, driveways, yards, sprinkler systems, who knows what else, and plenty of paved roads. Yes?
What lakes in Acton and Westford were they picked from? Or what vernal pools in Acton and Westford?
One was Bobby's Pond, and the other one was off of Arlington Street.
Yeah, they're they don't really have names, they're just names in my notebook.
Yeah.
They're not big like bodies of water.
Oh, because I know that a number of vernal pools in Acton are actually now dead because of leaching from, unfortunately, buried toxic waste. So I mean, I guess the question is, do you factor in the general environmental health of the lakes when you do these studies?
I didn't for this one. I mean,
These particular ponds are ones in an area that used to be a farm not too long ago. There's no real problems that I know of nearby there, and the other one's on town land, close to potential contaminants or somebody's neighborhood lawn type things. It's not near any of the Superfund sites that I'm familiar with.
yeah, they're not the type of ponds you like Stonewall ponds, so they're in a more secluded area. So that kind of gets back to Dr. Betancourt's question of how much are roads like 495 fragmenting these populations. So it's unlikely that the Acton and Westford populations are communicating with each other. They're probably not breeding with each other because of all the fragmentation. Whereas the mountain populations, we would think maybe they are.
But historically, I mean, Westford only got built out in the last 50 years, Acton in the last 100 years.
Right.
So you're still, yeah, so it's not unexpected at all that they would still be more similar to one another now. It's because you're still seeing the evidence of past hand mixes, I guess you would call it.
Right. But still, like, why wouldn't mountain populations be
Fair point, yeah.
pan-mictic? Because
Yep.
they're closer and still don't have much fragmentation.
Yeah.
So thinking about, considering how these trends might have evolved, we got to think about migration as we've been discussing when interpreting the data. It's kind of an unresolved concept whether to treat amphibian breeding sites as independent populations. So is one pond an independent population from another pond? Yes.
I'm sorry, it may be inherent in what you did, but I wonder, can you have downhill migration more easily than uphill from the summit down? And would that influence things?
That's a good question.
I'm thinking like, water.
That's a really good point.
That's a really good point. I guess as soon as you
It's
said that,
true.
I imagined like aliens come and dropping off populations at the peak of the mountain, and then they find their way down.
Or the water rivulets coming down and
Yeah.
Right.
the little.
But they had to get up there from the bottom.
But it wouldn't affect locomotion. Animals of that size aren't affected energetically going up or down
Yeah.
that size, so it's not gonna matter on the energetic
Yeah.
level.
Unless it's
Right.
And there's
But
so
if they're
much-
gonna follow wet, it's more likely that they would go down.
But they're so much closer to the ground. I think we tend to, as humans,
Yeah,
that's
think
true.
about gravity in a different
That's
perspective
true.
than they do.
That's a good point.
Huh.
Fun discussion.
Hadn't
Hadn't thought about that, Dr. Shea. Thank you. So it's kind of a somewhat accepted precept to just treat vernal pools that are separated by less than 400 meters or so as subpopulations. So therefore, I did treat the two summit populations as subpopulations as opposed to independent populations, because we're just not sure. We can't be positive that they're acting on their own. But they do tend to disperse less than other amphibian species. So, it's kind of it's up in the air is what I'm trying to say. It's definitely an unresolved issue in treating the data as to whether or not those two summit populations are doing their own thing or if they're just switching sites all the time. Could be determined by market capture studies, but that hasn't been done. So is this really local adaptation or is it like a founder effect? In non-breeding populations, you would expect consistent mutation rates and like a uniform allele distribution at neutral loci. Obviously, that's not the case in these populations. And then, as we've been discussing, those matches versus summit ponds, those results kind of suggest adaptation or genetic drift after a founder effect. So I had to consider that as a possibility to explain the results. So genetic drift would have a greater effect in small populations like these, and genetic drift is just the divergence that's more of a result of sampling.